networking, and lots of fun stuff for you to experience at, the Central Library was an incredible host to that for 2 years, and then we had to go virtual. So hopefully this is our last virtual version of the Midwest Volunteerism Summit. Last year was an interesting time for all of us, and I'm really excited that we actually have an expert in the field, if you will, that's joining us today that will be leading us through not just some incredible content, but also some conversations and some interaction with one another. Just a reminder that this is an elongated meeting, so we do plan on going through 10:30. We hope that everybody can stay for the entire time, but we do understand that some of you have to skip off a little bit early, but please try and stick around till 10:30. We think that the breakout sessions and different conversations that we're going to have together are going to be pretty meaningful to you. So, something incredible has come out of this pandemic, and that's our ability to welcome a lot of people more regularly to these virtual meetings. And as we look forward to what next year brings, we do hope and anticipate coming back in person for a majority of our meetings, but also allowing for the ability to bring in guest speakers from all over the nation has been a wonderful byproduct of being able to go virtual so easily. So we don't envision that going away anytime soon. But one of those in-person things that is finally coming back to us as it went virtual last year is Indivolved. If you're not aware of Indivolved, from my perspective, is the largest volunteer recruitment opportunity that this city provides. And I would venture to say that the state provides, honestly, because there are so many incredible resources there. Sarah, do you want to speak on it a little bit or just throw the link in the chat?
Yeah, sure. I'll throw the link in the chat for the application process, which is just basic information about your organization and your plans to engage young professionals in the city. But overall, Exodus has been involved in Indivolved for the last 2 years. So our first year was at 2019, and it was at the Indianapolis Public Library, and it was super big and really awesome. And if you know me, I hate going to events and setting up a table and standing at the table. But that was I attended as one staff member, and I did not sit down that day. I kept talking to people all evening, which was really great. So if you're going, I definitely recommend taking another staff member with you. But yeah, it helped. We've recruited a lot of people to sign up for a newsletter and follow us on social media and volunteers that day. And then last year they switched Indivolved to a virtual concept. It was more so panels broken up by different topics, and they talked with different nonprofit leaders. And so Exodus was a part of that too, and it was really meaningful. And again, we've gotten several specifically young professional volunteers Exodus through Indie Hub. So I definitely highly recommend it. And I think it's once you get accepted, it's $25 or $75, I forget, but it's not the fee is also very, very manageable too.
And it's definitely well worth it, the expenditure. So if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to any of the board members or your fellow CEBA members that have attended in the past. I have attended religiously since I took on my original role as manager of volunteer services at then the IMA, but now Newfields. And it's just been worthwhile. At the very least, networking with your peers all in the same space, or at least getting to see everyone and say hi, has been phenomenal. So please, please, please do that. I also want to say a personal thank you, and I'm speaking on behalf of Sheila because I'm not sure if she's feeling better enough to speak yet, but I know that she was a little under the weather. But a thank you to all of you from the board and from the organization as a whole for bearing with us throughout this trying last year. Many things happened, and I think the resiliency of this group to not just continue, but to thrive and continue pushing ourselves to learn and be better and to adapt to a constantly changing landscape has been absolutely phenomenal. So my hat's off to all of you as well as our board, and we thank you for sticking with us. We've got a lot more exciting things to come in the next year, and we can't wait to unveil those to you. But definitely hats off to, congratulations on surviving another year. And hopefully next year is going to be much different and much better for all of us. Also, a personal thank you to Absolutely. Hi, Sheila, you're on.
I'm having a rough time this week, so I guess you can all tell. So I didn't want to get on screen, but I just want to echo Chris for to thank everybody for really hanging in there with us. It was a tough year. 2020 was tough in all kinds of ways, even for us when we're trying to bring you good information as volunteer managers and supporters. So just it's a heartfelt thank you to everybody, and just looking for a better year next year for all of us. So sorry, Chris, sorry to interrupt, but I did want
No,
to say
that's
something,
great. Thank
even though
you.
I didn't want people to see me with my eye patch or anything. So,
It's all good. You look
all
lovely.
right.
Lovely. You make that eye patch look lovely.
Thank you all.
Special thank you also to our board. We do have elections that we have to do this morning, which will be coming up next. This has been an incredible board to serve with. You've all been really inspiring to me to continue to want to do this work and hopefully continue to be a leader amongst this group. And it's been my personal pleasure and delight. Helping to lift each other up throughout this last year has kept me going personally. So thank you so much for your service to this organization and continued service for most of us. With that being said, we do have an election that we have to do. It is a slate that has been presented and communicated ahead of time. Christine is going to bring it up one last time just so you can see it. This is a simple up or down vote to accept the slate as presented by the board for election for service for the next year, or a down vote. I promise there is no personal feelings involved here. So if you do feel so inclined to be a down vote, that is okay. We want all voices to be heard. So the slate, as you are seeing now, myself has been nominated for presidency. Kaylee with the Girl Scouts is vice president, Janelle as treasurer, Sarah as communications and secretary. That is a dual role position. Casey as membership, Lauren for hospitality, Wendy for education, Sheila as a member at large, and Christina continuing on in a member at large role. Before I go into the actual election, do I have any questions about the slate from the membership? Hearing none, do I have a motion to pass the slate as stated?
I move that we pass the slate. This is Meg Duth.
Thank you, Meg. Do I have a second to pass the slate?
I'll second it. It's Mary Friend.
Thank you, Mary. Seconded. All those in favor? You can do a check mark, high five, thumbs up. Clapping works too. You can throw it in the chat as well. I'm seeing lots of thumb marks up. All those opposed? Correct me if I'm wrong, board, but I believe the slate has passed as stated. All right. Looks like we have a new board.
Woo-hoo.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited. This is going to be an incredible year, and we have lots in store. Congratulations to those that just got elected, and can't wait to get to work with you all. If you weren't aware, our board does do a retreat. We are doing an in-person retreat thanks to the kind invitation of the Girl Scouts of Central Indiana for lending us part of their campus. We are going to go and meet in person, which I'm really excited. It's been quite a while since this group has been able to get together in person, and we will be able to hammer out the details for next year, including what version of in-person and virtual meetings we will be having, content, all sorts of fun stuff. So be looking for an update coming out of that board meeting from the board to let you know a little bit about what is going on in the future. Very briefly, is Janelle on? Janelle, you here? Yeah, okay. We are in open enrollment. If you have not renewed, please do so as soon as possible. If you have new friends that want to join CIEVA, now is the time. We want to get them signed up so that they can kick off the new year, at least our new year, which is a mid-year start, on a strong foot with lots of members, learning lots of fun things. And we will definitely be looking forward to bringing you all back in person. All right, board, anything I'm forgetting before I skip forward to introduce Nathan? I'm seeing a no. We covered it all. All right, without further ado, the man of the hour and the real reason you're here, somebody that I am very proud to consider a friend and an incredible peer and colleague. Nathan and I have been working together for quite some time on some great, wonderful things for Newfields, and that has helped me immensely and has helped our institution immensely. And he is here to lend his expertise to this group and focus us on what's to come, where we're at, and how do we push forward. So Nathan, without further ado, I turn the floor over to you. Welcome.
Great, thanks a bunch. I appreciate it. I know we're going to be here about an hour and 15 minutes, so if you have to mute and step away, please feel free to. And hopefully there'll be a nugget or two that you can take away today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me just one moment. All right, there you have it. Thank you. That's all for the day. Let me get my screen set up. I like to start with that because I know some folks are going to be peeling off as we hit the 10 o'clock hour and might not be able to stay on the whole time. I think CIEVA is a wonderful organization. It's one that I drive by students at Indiana State University too, and try to get them involved. I think a few have made it in online, but you guys do great work. It's just the best group in the state of Indiana in this space, and really appreciate the collegiality with all of you that I've had a chance to get to know in breakout rooms over the last year and a half. So thank you, and I appreciate you all having me today. Chris, we should be good. You get my screen projected there? All right. Well, what we're going to talk about today is a topic that your board asked me to cover based on some needs assessment data. What we wanted to really hear about was ultimately staff and volunteer relationships, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And really come back to some of the research that I do on organizational culture. And you're going to hear me say a lot that culture really ultimately trumps any strategy. And you're going to hear that message over and over again. If we don't tend to organizational culture, it's going to impact whatever strategy you use for volunteer engagement. So mostly today we'll be hitting on some organizational culture research. And we're going to kind of crescendo with how do you train your staff to build constructive relationships with volunteers to increase satisfaction and retention. And so without further ado, I'm actually gonna move some things on my screen so I'm not consistently looking to the right. Bear with me here just a second. I'm gonna mute my camera for just a moment and do a quick stop share. We're gonna get this projection to come onto my screen with my camera. I think that's going to be a better plan here. We'll do it this way. That'll work. All right, Chris, and we should still be good, right, with what you're seeing here?
Not seeing your screen back up yet.
Okay, all right, that'll work. That'll work better. I can look at the same screen that my camera's looking at me with. So as I said, we can't talk about staff training and we can't talk about staff and volunteer relationships unless we really peel it back to culture. So at my company, Driven Strategic, I really like to hang our hat on kind of three key areas: strategic living, strategic nonprofit leadership, and strategic service engagement. And today we're going to really talk about volunteer engagement as a tool for strategic nonprofit leadership. I know some of you, but not everybody does. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of my background, I do have 2 hats for my bald little head here. I am a faculty member at Indiana State University, where I run our nonprofit leadership minor and a concentration on our Master's of Public Administration program. And then I also run the Recreation Management and Youth Leadership major and minor. So that's what many of you might think of as a Parks and Recreation management degree. So I spend a lot of time in the space of youth recreation programs, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, campfire, mentoring programs, after school programs, as well as park foundations and friends groups around the country. I do a lot of work in the space of service learning and really doing university community partnerships. And when I went in and applied for candidacy for my CVA, I really pitched myself as a student volunteer manager in a university setting. Like some of you are volunteer managers in hospitals or healthcare settings. I really, projected my candidacy from a student volunteer management standpoint, really engaging students as volunteers in community-based organizations. So just a little background where I come from. I spend a lot of time as a consultant in these kinds of organizations. And I think many of you are represented there on that list. Chris, as he mentioned, with arts organizations. And today I'm going to use 4 examples with permission. Newfield, Special Olympics Indiana, Tippecanoe County CASA, and Ronald McDonald House. And so you're going to see today the examples I give are real examples from some of the peers that are on the call today. And it really cuts across the nonprofit sector with arts organizations, sports organizations, human and social services, and then also some health, medical, and special needs related organizations. And I think you're going to find that all of them are exactly the same when it comes to volunteer engagement. I like to think of nonprofits as a cheeseburger. It's really simple. They just all have the same ingredients. The mission might be different, the vision might be different, the programs might be different, but ultimately we have to really prepare an organization with all the right ingredients if we're going to use volunteers to get to the outcomes with the program participants or the target audience that we serve. And you can see there, in that metaphor of a hamburger, a cheeseburger, that volunteer engagement is one of the critical ingredients of almost every nonprofit organization. And you're going to find that, we really have trends where we're seeing volunteer engagement looking more and more like human resources. And we tend to, as a field, we're getting better at aligning our volunteer relationships with our donor relationships, and maybe not merging those departments certainly, but at least making sure the left hand and the right hand, being the volunteer manager and the director of development, are on the same page, and finding ways to get our softwares like Bloomerang and Volgistics, to make sure that we're talking about who's in each system, and how do we recognize volunteers who are also donors, and how do we make consistent, reliable volunteers donors, and really understanding how important that relationship basis between a staff member and a volunteer is, not even for continued volunteer engagement, but also for building the donor relationship. So this, my friends, is not a Moscow Mule. I was accused of that on a webinar last week. It is just water. You're going to see I have 2 coffees and 2 waters, so 4 mugs. So just, if you know what's going on there. And today we're going to focus just on the volunteer piece here. And I like to think of volunteers as mission-focused human resources. And that's intentionally shaped like an Elmer's glue bottle, because I really believe, our staff and volunteers both are mission-focused human resources. And I think we get a little bit caught up, at least kind of at the ground level, with I'm staff, you're a volunteer, or I'm staff and you're only a volunteer, or I'm just a volunteer and you're staff. But recognizing anybody that's coming to the table to do the work of the organization on behalf of the mission to help the target audience that organization serves, they are people that are coming together to focus on a mission, paid or unpaid, full-time or part-time, salaried or not, benefits or not. They're really, really mission-focused human resources. And most of your organizations, that's disproportionately volunteers, somewhere in the case of 70 to 80% volunteers to 15 to 20% staff. And so the point I like to make in all of this is every organization has a target population, as you can see in the top left screen. It might be a certain demographic. I just came off of a consulting project where we were focused on 2nd through 5th grade African-American males who had low reading comprehension at an organization up at Lafayette. I just came off of another consulting project that focused on 12 to 24-year-old females who had been human trafficked and or commercially sexually exploited. So every organization's got a target audience, whether it's clear or not. It might be broader, might be more specific, but we all have a target audience that in our strategic plans, we've set some SMART objectives, some short-term outcomes, and some strategic outputs in our strategic plans that we're a part of the solution or tasked with helping those individuals develop. Down in the bottom right, you basically have your governance function that really starts at the base with needs assessment and works through objectives, outputs, and outcomes. But ultimately in that governance function, you have a mission and a vision. And what's between the target population and your mission and vision, it's your human resources, it's your staff and volunteers, and those people have to have good relationships. Disproportionately, it's the volunteers that have to be sticky like glue to stick to that target population. And through relationships and through experiences and programs and services, we have to pull them towards our developmental outcomes and our mission and vision. So just so absolutely critical. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but how important it is for volunteers to work with our target audience to get them to our mission in some measurably impactful way. The problem is so many times that we're finding in these organizations that our staff and volunteers just don't have relationships at the quality and depth that we need for the organization to be successful. But at the start and end, everything comes back to vision and mission. Why are we here and what are we doing? And staff and volunteer employee relations is a critical part of the puzzle if you're going to make a measurable impact on your mission and vision. So as a volunteer manager, and also with the rest of your colleagues and your organizations, as an organization, you're going to have to make decisions. I hope you're making data-driven decisions. I hope you're making decisions that are strategic for your organization. I hope that you're not making decisions on the TFAR model, that feels about right, or the we've always done it that way model. But just know that decision-making is one of those core management functions that we as volunteer managers, executive directors, program directors, development directors have to make. And I hope when you come to a Zoom meeting or a conference table at your offices and you have the chance to make important decisions for your mission, I hope that you're making data-driven decisions that are strategic. Now, I know it's Pride Month, and I saw a really funny T-shirt the other day. There was a Gen Xer with a Pink Floyd shirt on. Has anybody seen this? And then there was a Centennial that said "Nice Pride shirt," but it was actually a Pink Floyd shirt. So it was kind of a funny meme that came through Facebook the other day. But I really liked that shirt. And when I saw that shirt and it had this prism on it, it really told me when we make decisions, we really need to give staff a tool to make decisions through, as well as our boards. And the prism that I look through for strategic nonprofit decision-making is every decision should be mission-focused and financially responsible. It should meet the needs of those you choose to serve, and it should establish, maintain, or enhance a healthy organizational culture. And if your organization, collectively or individually, people are making decisions that aren't all four of those things, you're probably going to have a problem, especially related to staff and volunteer relationships. This idea of financially responsible means that, you know what, something is so mission focused that we're willing to lose money in providing a program or service for the organization. Or the idea, I've had clients related to volunteerism that they don't want to invest in volunteer recognition because it's taken money away from the program participants. And I had to help them understand that when they invest in their volunteer program, they are investing in their target population, because without trained volunteers that have a good retention rate that are feeling appreciated, those folks aren't going to come back and keep delivering a quality program over and over and over again. And getting them to recognize that sometimes it is financially responsible to move money out of a program budget and move it over to volunteer recognition or volunteer training or whatever it might be. But those are really the 4 points of what I've developed myself, and at least in my consulting and in my practice. The 4 points of a strategic nonprofit decision: to be mission focused, financially responsible, meets the needs of those you choose to serve, and then contributes to a healthy organizational culture. And I highlight that culture piece blue because, remember, every organization has the same ingredients, and every organization has a wrapper around their hamburger, and that wrapper is culture. That culture, whether you can see it or not, is going to impact your organization for the good or for the bad, but it is going to impact things. So I think before I go on, I'm going to pause for a moment and just see if there are any questions or any redirections or clarifications I can make for anybody that's on the call today. I'm not able to see the chat, so I'm hoping maybe a board member or Chris maybe could monitor that chat and see if anybody needs to interject or slow me down a bit.
I don't have anything currently in the chat, but members, please feel free to throw something in there.
Yeah, I don't want you to feel like we can't stop and chit chat about some of
Yeah.
this. So just recognize culture always trumps strategy. Every nonprofit has the same ingredients, and that wrapper really represents that culture. So as I get into organizations for consulting, my dad says, my son always asks me, what kind of doctor are you? You don't wear a white coat. And I said, well, I basically am a doctor for nonprofit organizations. I said, I try to listen really well, and I hear what they have to say. And then I try to diagnose things and then prescribe certain kinds of medicine to help them in forms of a plan. And so what I find is that as I get in and start listening to an organization, whether I come in to do program evaluation consulting or strategic planning or volunteer engagement or fundraising consulting, I always find that I have to look at that organization kind of like an onion, and I got to start at their vision, and I got to peel back to their mission, and then peel back to their outputs, outcomes, and objectives, to their structure, to their strategy, to their culture. And so many times I find that for me to really diagnose them and prescribe them a strategy that's going to work, we have to peel it all the way back to organizational culture, because that idea that culture always trumps strategy. And so the other thing that I found is it's really silly to, if you have a culture issue, to prescribe a human resource strategy, or if you have a structure issue, to offer a program strategy. What we really have to do is look at this onion and work backwards. And so if you start down here at the bottom, you start with vision, back it up to mission. If it's not a mission problem, is it an outcomes issue? If it's not an outcomes issue, is it an outputs issue? If it's not an outputs issue, is it an objectives issue? If it's not an objectives issue, is it a resource issue? If it's not that, is it a structure issue? Is it a strategy issue? Or is it ultimately a culture issue? It's taken me about 30 years to kind of come up with this, but I guess in my own head, I'm asking myself, riddle me this, as I get a challenge to work with an organization and really accurately get under the hood and diagnose what's wrong with that truck. I really start, okay, well, where are they at on their vision? Are they anywhere close? Where are they at on their mission? And I just keep backing that all the way back. And usually I wouldn't say usually, many times it peels all the way back to culture, even if we're having a volunteer strategy issue. So with that, when you really look at culture trumps strategy, I want to focus or hone in on this concept that structure requires resources. So structure could be structure of the organizational chart and structure of the volunteer program as it relates to staff and the board. Structure could be policies, procedures. Structure could be the format and the content of the budget. Okay, so think of the things that give structure to your organization: budgets, organizational charts, personnel, committee structures, policies, procedures. That's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about strategy drives structure. So I always find it interesting, if we decide that we have a good culture, a healthy, constructive culture, then we get into strategic planning, because so many times people are having culture issues, but they want a strategic plan to fix it. It's like, hang on, a strategic plan is not going to replace the culture issue. We need to back up and fix the culture issue, and then come up with a strategy. And so many organizations, I find it really interesting. So many organizations, when they do a strategic plan, is their plans aren't always that actionable. And rarely does a strategic plan for a nonprofit include volunteer engagement. Now, one of the clients that I worked with, and I was really impressed with Mary Friend's shop over at Ronald McDonald House, volunteerism is fingerprinted all over their strategic plan. And you look at their strategic plan, if that volunteer engagement function is not working, they're not going to be successful, because I mean, their volunteers are their secret sauce, and volunteer engagement is a central part of their strategic plan. The other thing I find really interesting is when we do a new strategic plan, we don't update the structure. We update the plan, but we don't change the position descriptions. We don't change the organizational chart. We don't redivide the labor between positions. We don't change the budget. We're still adding 5% every fiscal year to the same budget, and we're not budgeting in an intentional way to effectuate our strategic plan. So that idea that once we fix culture issues and get on the right track, then we do a strategic plan. Oftentimes people jump right past structure, looking at policies, procedures, organizational charts, divisions of labor, budget formats and content, and how do we match the priorities of the strategic plan? Are those priorities reflected in the structure of the organizational chart, the budget, the policies and procedures? So with that, structure really requires resources. And these are in general kind of the 4 buckets of resources that nonprofits have to help them do their important work for their mission. And I really, want to focus in on the human resources, the staff and volunteers, but the structure requires resources. We have to have resources to have staff. And we all know that volunteerism is not free, and that we have to particularly have financial resources to effectuate our volunteer program. We also have to recognize that human resources are also volunteer resources, and that it's the volunteer resources that really accomplish our objectives, produce our outputs, and achieve our outcomes. And just really recognizing from a culture standpoint and a strategy standpoint and a structure standpoint that most of us are relying on volunteers to really do the heavy lifting of the organization with the people that we choose to serve. And that if we're going to get to our vision, we have to get to our mission. If we're going to get to our mission, we have to get to outcomes. If we're going to get to outcomes, we have to get to outputs. And volunteers are the absolute secret sauce for almost every organization for doing that in terms of making a measurable impact on their mission. So I think I've kicked the dead horse here. Culture always trumps strategy. Always, 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 always trumps strategy. And recognizing that culture is a volunteer resource issue at all levels in nonprofit organizations. It's really important to understand that culture is a volunteer resource issue at all levels of an organization. With that, culture, and a lot of people say, well, what exactly is organizational culture? Douglas in 2021 published this illustration, and it's a good fit. Organizational culture is amplified by the behaviors or leaders, which includes the volunteer management professionals. It's embedded in a network of organizational practices. It's evident in the behaviors of individuals and groups in the workplace. There are shared beliefs, values, and assumptions held by members of the organization, and it's visible in the way that work gets done on a day-to-day basis. So when we really think about, when we keep saying culture trumps strategy, what are we talking about when we say organizational culture? So a couple things I like to boil it down to is ultimately organizational culture is the way we do things around here. It's the unwritten rules that drive behavior. And more importantly, it's the unwritten rules that drive staff and volunteer behavior in an organization. And I think some organizations are big enough, especially some of our confederated nonprofits like the Boy Scouts or multi-tiered organizations like Special Olympics. There's a staff culture and there's a volunteer culture. And then there's the staff and volunteer culture. And sometimes we even have culture issues between long-serving volunteers and new volunteers, depending on the organization that you're in. But how we go about doing things, those unwritten rules that guide workplace behavior, are the things that we have to wrap our head around and make sure that those things are constructive. Organizational culture is going to come out in volunteer employee relationships related to how supported your volunteers feel, how respected they are, the civility of the workplace and in person or online, the collegiality among staff and volunteers, emotional intelligence, and how that leads to conflict resolution. So a lot of soft relational people skill stuff, which is exactly what we have to ensure volunteer employee relationships are strong if we're going to have a culture that doesn't trump strategy. So with that, organizational culture is learned, and I think it's pretty clear it can be toxic. I think I've made the point that culture is a volunteer resource issue. So with that, I want to pause. Chris, do we have anything in the chat yet for questions? Are we doing okay so far?
I think we're doing okay so far.
With culture, it's important to realize that a toxic culture, or what human synergistics calls a defensive culture, and you're going to hear me use those terms interchangeably. I think most of us use the term toxic. The best research out there calls a toxic culture a defensive culture, and they call a healthy culture a constructive culture. So toxic, defensive, healthy, constructive, you'll hear me use those terms interchangeably. So a toxic culture is a volunteer satisfaction issue, and it's also a volunteer retention issue. I think it's pretty clear that culture is a human resource issue. It does cause staff turnover issues. Toxic culture is a financial issue, and a toxic culture is a mission issue. And so as an organization and as a volunteer manager, I recognize this group of folks. Some of you are in the C-suite in your organization. Many of your organizations kind of push the volunteer coordinator or volunteer manager kind of down at the lower ends of the full-time staff organizational chart. But wherever you land on your organization and wherever you land in your persuasion and your ability to influence in your organization, I think it's really important to start talking about in a way that you can manage across and manage up and manage down, is bring some attention to organizational culture and at best not accuse your organization that there is a culture issue, but at least to try to describe, if you were, to host an interview or a volunteer interview or a staff interview, and the question comes, would you describe your organizational culture to me? What would you say? How would you describe the organizational culture to a potential staffer or to a potential volunteer? And if you can't, I think it's important that you spend some time doing that, maybe yourself to start, and then maybe within your department, and then maybe with your peers, and then maybe get some input from those below you on the organizational chart, and then maybe start the conversation gently with those above you. I think you'll find that if you start a conversation to get your organization to recognize and tend to organizational culture, other things can fall into place pretty quickly. So what we know from an HR standpoint from the work of Osborne is that attracting and retaining top talent is one of the greatest culture challenges. And top talent, I don't just mean staff, paid staff, full-time salaried staff, but I mean part-time staff. And I also mean all types of volunteers, from long-serving volunteers to e-volunteers to episodic volunteers to group volunteerism. Recruiting top talent to help us do the work of our organization is by far one of the greatest culture challenges. And so with that, culture is a mission issue and it's a vision issue. And that's why we say culture always trumps strategy. And so I don't, as volunteer administrators and peers and colleagues, I don't want you in your office banging your head on the wall every time you try a different strategy with your volunteer program that it doesn't work, because you might not be backing it all the way up to culture. So with that, there are some resources here. Human Synergistics is the leading, what I would call the leading consulting organization and research organization that researches organizational culture. And they started by Robert Cook, who's a PhD he's either at the University of Chicago or the University of Illinois at Chicago. I think he's at UIC or was at UIC. And all of his research was in organizational culture across sectors, private corporations, public divisions and departments of different layers of government, as well as in the nonprofit sector. And his research has turned into this consulting firm that's an international organization, and they do culture change processes all over the world, from breweries in Bavaria to hospitals in Brazil to nonprofits in California. And they have a number of scientifically reliable and valid instruments that are used in their consulting process. And one of them is what they call the OCI, so Organizational Culture Inventory. They also have the OEI, the Organizational Effectiveness Inventory. And they also have two others among others, but two I'll share. One is called MI, Management Impact, and another is called LI, Leadership Impact. And I will say this, with their work, it's really good stuff. And if you've not had a chance to learn about organizational culture research, and if I could only send you to one spot, I would send you to Human Synergistics work. Now, they're not cheap. If you do a full culture change process like you read in their books, you're talking about a 5 to 10 year comprehensive process. But even without engaging in Human Synergistics full menu, and I get no kickbacks, I have no relationship with them other than reading their books and doing their training. There's a lot to be learned, and by educating yourself on their research and how their instruments work, I think you can start to describe your culture and do some initial diagnosis internally. And then if you hire a volunteer management consultant or a strategic planning consultant locally for whatever reason that's not tied to Human Synergistics, I think you'll find that their work and research will get you to think in new ways about how culture impacts relationships and how those relationships impact the outputs and outcomes and mission and vision that you're trying to achieve. So I stumbled across them about 3 or 4 years ago when I was building a effective staff supervision course for Leaderosity for the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. And I investigated them, and I built that course in partnership with 501c Services. 501c Services is actually a for-profit insurance company. I don't know if most of you know or not, but federal law, if you're a 501c3, you can actually opt out of your state's unemployment program. And if you opt out and you have an unemployment claim, then you pay out of pocket. It would be like if you opted out of car insurance illegally and then got in a wreck, you would have to pay out of pocket. So if you legally opt out as a 501c3 of your state's unemployment insurance program, you can opt out and not pay into that program, but then you would have to pay out of pocket. So 501c Services is an insurance company who provides unemployment insurance for those nonprofits that opt out of their state's program. And basically their shtick is that if you opt out of your state for 60% of the cost that you would be paying the state, you can get their insurance. And so they're no different than any other insurance company. They want to limit claims and payouts, just like State Farm and, Progressive and Allstate. And they want, just like State Farm and Allstate want drivers to drive safely so they have less wrecks and stop texting and driving. 501c Services wants to make sure that staff members on the front line are effective staff supervisors. What we know is that people quit their bosses, not their jobs. And so if they're not going to pay out unemployment insurance, they would have to ensure that staff supervisors are better at relational staff development. So as I developed that course for them, I dug in and I came across by accident Human Synergistics research. And so I built the course for 501c Services. And then I went to Utah and spoke to their board. And then I wrote 3 articles on organizational culture, heavily tied to some of the work of Human Synergistics. And then when I was at home last year, July, I think I did 2 days in July, 2 days in September, and 1 day in October. I did 5 full days of training and got accredited to use their OCI and their OEI and their LI and their MI. And I'm accredited to use those, but the cost of using them are really pretty high that most of my clients don't have the budget to hire me and for me to use their instruments. However, the tool that you see on your screen is their Circumplex. And what there is there's a way to use this if you're not quite ready to go through a full organizational culture inventory. And so I'm going to click on this and pull up a website. And I'm going to pop this link into the chat for you. And I hope that you'll play around with it on your screen as I'm playing around with it on mine for you.
Oh, message him.
I'm trying to get into the chat and it's not popping a chat box up for me here. Bear with me just 1 second. Yeah, I'll have to, let me stop share for a moment, see if I can get the chat in. It's not letting me chat. There we go. Okay, I'm going to chat this through to everyone. I think if you play with this, I think what it's going to do is get you to start thinking more in the framework of what a constructive organizational culture is and what behaviors, those unwritten rules that guide behavior, to help you start establishing at least a healthy culture within your department. Chris, are you seeing my screen again?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's get the inventory up here. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit. What you're going to find if you play with this is an interactive thing. So you can put on the individual level, you can set it on the leadership level, and depending on the level that you set this on, it's going to change the behaviors that are described over here in the gray box on the right. So you're most of you are with whatever title are in the volunteer manager role. So we can set it on that. And then notice if I scroll on to perfectionistic, this pie piece, you can see that it describes the behaviors that a manager would do that would create a toxic culture, or what they call a defensive culture, for people within their organization, whether that's staff or volunteers. So the manager or leader motivates and drives others to set unrealistically high goals, stays on top of every detail, and works long hours to attain narrowly defined objectives. Okay, so these are things that you would do as a manager that would either make a healthy culture or a toxic culture, a defensive culture or a constructive culture. And so the idea here is red and green are bad. You don't want red or green. Red or green, if you're doing the behaviors described in red or green, you're doing things to create a toxic or what they call a defensive culture. Now the red is toxic or what they call defensive, but it's aggressive defensive, where green is defensive, but it's passive defensive. So you might avoid a volunteer, or you might behave in terms of approval, that the manager or leader motivates and requires others to gain the approval of those around them, go along with people, and maintain superficially pleasant interpersonal relationships. So at the very least, I hope you take this circumflex away and learn about human synergistics and about their research related to the organizational culture inventory, and think about the language as you just try to, on your own, try to write down the culture of your organization. How would you describe it based on this? So the good news is the blue is what you want. The blue is these are the behaviors that leaders and managers do to build a constructive or healthy culture. Here under achievement, the manager or leader motivates and encourages others to set challenging but realistic goals, establishes plans to reach those goals and pursue them with enthusiasm. Self-actualizing, the manager or leader motivates and encourages others to gain enjoyment from their work, develop themselves professionally, and approach problems with interest, creativity, integrity. Wow, that sounds like volunteer engagement to me, doesn't it? Humanistic encouraging, the manager or leader motivates and encourages others to be supportive of people, help those around them to grow and develop, and provide others with positive feedback. Again, all of these things sound like principles of volunteer engagement. Affiliative, the manager or leader motivates and encourages others to treat people as members of the team, paid or unpaid, because we're all mission-focused human resources, to be sensitive to their needs and of others, and interact in friendly and cooperative ways. So I hope that you'll play with this. Recognize that when an organization does the organizational culture inventory, it will plot where they're at in averages on this circumflex. So you'll be able to get a look at this and go, okay, here's where we are, but where do we want to go? And what it will look like, let me go ahead and just minimize that. What it will look like is if you were to embark on a organizational culture inventory process with human synergistics, they would survey your staff and volunteers with the OCI, and they would do the first OCI would be what's the preferred culture, and then the second survey is what's the current culture. And this is pretty typical of what we find, is that the current culture looks like this. This is all the data for all the staff and volunteers in the organization on what the current culture is. which is saying it's toxic, okay? Because there's a whole bunch of red and green and basically no blue. That's saying that's a defensive or toxic culture, which is probably pretty bad for staff and volunteer relationships. The preferred culture you can see is a lot less red or green, but a whole lot of blue, okay? And so this is just an example of how using their surveys and going through a change process is we really, even if you estimate where you're at and try to put plans in place to fix culture issues, you really need two things. You need to know what your culture is now, how people perceive the culture now across the organization at all levels, and then how do they prefer it, and figure out where that gap's at so that you can put a plan in place to move from the current culture to the preferred culture. And what we find from a volunteer management standpoint in nonprofits is when you're managing volunteers, okay, when you're using volunteer management principles, traditional volunteer management, you're usually looking at a more toxic or defensive culture, as opposed to when you use principles of volunteer engagement, you're likely more contributing to a healthier, constructive culture. And one of the points that I'm going to make today is, yes, culture trumps strategy. How do we build a healthier, more constructive culture so we have stronger volunteer and staff relationships? And what we want to do is use principles of volunteer engagement so that we can move from a current culture that might not be constructive enough to a more preferred or more constructive culture. So I'd be glad to pause. I think we have till 10:30, right, Chris? So this is a lot to take in. I'm summarizing some other people's research, and then from a very academic standpoint, trying to bridge theory and practice to give you some tools to take research on organizational culture and apply it to your practice as a volunteer manager. So I would be glad to take any questions or any comments that anybody would like to throw in at this point.
Mohammed stated that you had already answered his question, but I will chime in with something, and others, please feel free to do so as well, or throw something in the chat. This whole organizational culture and really taking a hard look at where you're at, where your organization's at, where your volunteers are, was one of the defining moments, at least I believe, in our process at then the IMA, now Newfields, is what we were really identifying is who's on board, who is ready to do the work and move forward. And what we realized pretty quickly is there were some people and very specific individuals that were roadblocks for us. And sadly, as part of this process, some of those individuals, volunteers very specifically, weren't ready to go and continue on the journey with us. And that was okay. And that needed to be okay so that the organization and our program as a whole could continue to grow and thrive, you know, in spite of some people just not being on board. And we found ourselves really confronting the fact that we had to make these hard decisions in order to protect the culture and to nurture a positive culture so that we could get to a better place for everybody involved.
No, good point. Good point with your experiences at Newfields. Anybody else like to add anything? So I'm not going to make you a organizational culture inventory expert. I would encourage you to plop around on their website and look at that circumplex and just Google human synergistics. Go to there. I think you'll learn a lot about organizational culture, and you'll get language to use as you're trying to write it down. If you were going to describe culture on a staff interview, or if you were going to put an organizational culture statement in your staff and volunteer handbooks, I think it would be important, you know, to use language that's consistent with the best research out there. So hopefully just a tool to use to start thinking about culture, and even just for self-reflection and, you know, where I'm at in the organizations I'm in. Okay, you know, where are you at? What was your body language like today in a meeting? How was your tone of voice? You know, was it, you know, are you pushing your staff too much, you know, with perfectionism? You know, that was an area that I struggle and probably still do, especially when I get tired and stressed out. I'm a perfectionist. It's just how I'm diagnosed. So recognizing that probably when I was a young manager, you know, working in Parks and Rec and with the Boy Scouts and, you know, the mid 90s, you know, when I was in my 20s, I was so passionate about a mission that I didn't realize I was behaving in a perfectionistic way, and probably causing my volunteer retention rate to drop because I was driving because I was so passionate about the mission, and I was perceived that I didn't care about the volunteers when I thought, God, I'm driving and working so hard because I care so much. And so there was a perception, and I didn't realize that was there. So even, even using that circumplex for some self-reflection, especially as you look at the manager leader level, I think you might find very helpful as you refine your leadership and management philosophies, whether you have that written down in a portfolio or not. But I think most of you at some point have had to write down your leadership and management philosophies, maybe for your college degrees or whatnot. But that's usually a good thing to do, and to use some of the language from there and go, okay, I need to work on that. I mean, all of us have been doing this probably a pretty long time. None of us are perfect, including me. And, this gives us a good barometer for how is our behavior as individuals in an organization, as a board member, a staff member, a volunteer, a consultant. How are we, how are we impacting those around us that cause behavioral norms that either contribute to a healthy or a toxic culture? So hopefully that makes sense without getting too far into the research, but I really want to focus on this bit about engaging volunteers and recognizing that I think all of one of our journals, the Volunteer Management Journal just renamed itself Engage. And I think you're seeing a ton of research with the service enterprise model out of the Points of Light Foundation that's really about principles of volunteer engagement. I think all of you are probably on board that our profession is moving from the term volunteer management to volunteer engagement, because there's a fundamental difference in the relationships and how we talk to and interact with volunteers as a manager versus an engager. And it's fundamentally different. Even to the point, I just renamed our courses, our RCSM 440 and RCSM 540 courses at Indiana State. I renamed them Volunteer Management to Volunteer Engagement to reflect changes in the field. So with that, mug number 3. With that, when we talk about engaging volunteers, especially as we apply it to volunteer-employee relationships, it's really asking ourselves, how are we as staff, and how are our staff, whether they're staff that direct reports to us or our colleagues or even our supervisors, how do they engage in constructive relationships with volunteers? Ultimately, some of the research that I'm going to share with you here in the next 30 minutes, or at least some of the work with four of your colleagues' organizations, is we did the volunteer audit and action planning process. And ultimately, that's about volunteer recruitment and retention, and recognizing that volunteer retention is ultimately about volunteer satisfaction. And really, if you keep peeling it back, volunteer satisfaction is ultimately about organizational culture. It's that idea that culture always trumps strategy. So satisfied volunteers are going to stick around longer. And typically, the longer they stay, the better they get trained, the more effective they get at working with our target populations and our service delivery, and likely the more impact we're making on our mission with the people that we're choosing to serve with our programs and services. So it's an important piece of the puzzle. So if done well, volunteer engagement can increase satisfaction, it can improve retention, and it can create a more constructive culture, making that culture less red and green and more blue. I think many of us have heard, and especially in the university world, when we do hires for faculty or deans or department chairs, everybody talks about fit. We're looking for a good fit. Really that's oftentimes code word for discrimination. Hire somebody that looks and sounds like us. It's often also the fit with culture. And I used to ask that, what do you mean by fit? Nobody would really say, well, fit, they think like me, look like me, talk like me, but ultimately fit with the behavioral norms of the organization or fit with culture. I think it's important to recognize when we're talking about fit, to approve a volunteer or to hire a staff member, even if we haven't written down and have articulated our culture, when we're looking for fit, we're trying to fit somebody with our culture. So something I want you to leave with today is I want you to be able to articulate your organizational culture as a part of the things that most of you can control in your organizations, which is your volunteer recruitment, selection, and onboarding process. I think volunteer employee relations, I think they really serve as a barometer for estimating the health of an organization's culture. Really, if you can put your pulse, think about taking a pulse. If you take a pulse of an organization, I think when you really look at volunteer employee relationships, I think that's a really great first indicator of whether your culture is green and or red, or if it's more blue. I think it's a great place to start. So here's the bugaboo of it all. And again, I brought in and got permission from 4 of my colleagues here today, and 4 organizations that regularly participate in CIEVA. But volunteer employee relations are consistently self-rated low by my clients. And so I'm going to get into a little bit about what the volunteer audit and action planning process is, as outlined by Susan Ellis, the late Susan Ellis, who designed that process. But bottom line is, by the time I get my clients through a audit and action planning process, I don't diagnose them that they have bad volunteer employee relationships. I facilitate a conversation, and almost all of them, out of 12 areas of volunteer engagement or volunteer management, usually rate volunteer employee relationships somewhere in the 10, 11, or 12 slot. It's an area that seems to be very self-critical, that people in those rooms really recognize how important it is and realize maybe they're not awful, but it's an area that they got to really put a focus on if they're serious about getting to their mission and vision. So a couple words of wisdom from the late Susan Ellis. I think most of you know Susan, or know of her work with Energize Inc. But she had some great quotes, as well as Stephen McCurley, that the interrelationship of volunteers and employees, it's really the single biggest obstacle to effective involvement, is getting volunteers and employees to work together as a well-oiled machine with all the cylinders firing at the same time. And recognizing that volunteers and paid staff really need to be partners in implementing the mission and programs of the organization, having an equal but complementary role to play. And we can't do any of that unless we're creating a culturally competent organization in all areas of diversity, in terms of justice, equity, accessibility, inclusion, and making sure that we're creating an organization where Jedi is impacting culture to make the culture more blue or more constructive. And recognizing that volunteers and prospective volunteers, for the most part, are what we would call internal customers, and recognize that volunteer relationships are an internal customer service process, and that customer service is not a department, it's an attitude. It's everybody. I mean, it's even the long-standing volunteer welcoming a new volunteer at the front desk when they walk in for their volunteer interview or their orientation. What we do is everybody's business in our organization. It's just that you are the expert, and you're the one that needs to coach principles of volunteer engagement into other staff. I've never met anybody that's come to volunteer to have a bad time or be treated like a second-class citizen. And I'm guessing in your volunteer life, you don't want to be talked down to or treated like a second-class citizen either. So this is some pretty sage advice from Steve McCurley, that the respect accorded a volunteer program manager is directly proportional to the respect accorded to work done by volunteers. And I think some of you are in organizations that really respect the work that you do and understand it, and others, you're kind of an island, isolated, where you're really banging your head against the wall to get resources to do the work that you need to do to make an impact on the mission. What McCurley finds is that staff tend to treat volunteers the way the management treats staff. And that's a quote's just a reflection of culture. And that's either going to be a constructive culture with the staff treating volunteers in a very constructive way, or it's a toxic culture. So I like to share, I think most of you have heard this before, but the golden rule to treat others the way you want to be treated has, although not bad advice, has really expired. We've got a better rule from the golden rule. We have the platinum rule that's more in line with principles of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, that we really need to treat others the way that they would like to be treated, and take the time to understand, preferred pronouns and how you would like to address people, and all the things that go in to building a culture and organizations that uses principles of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, and really start living and breathing the platinum rule to make your organizations have a more constructive culture. The bottom line to all this is that changing culture And moving from volunteer management to engagement can't be done to staff. It has to be done with staff. And you're going to have to bring them along in a process. That staff below you, next to you, other departments above you, whoever it is, your job is to be the cheerleader and the coach and to educate them on what volunteer engagement is, how it impacts culture, and how important the relationships that they take to develop with volunteers is for getting your target population to their mission. So we really want to jump into, like, how are you prioritizing volunteer engagement in your organizations, and why should you? And I go back to a very early slide. It's just this simple. You all have a target audience and you have a mission and vision. And what's between that? It's your mostly your volunteers and your staff. And if your mission focused human resources can't get along and don't have a constructive, healthy relationship and culture, then, you know, this missing piece is going to be missing. We're not going to have the people in the middle to pull that target population to the mission. It's just absolutely critical. It really just all comes down to mission and vision. So
she said, you know,
I want to pause and see if anybody has questions at this point before I continue on to some of our client examples.
I think there is a great question in the chat, Nathan.
Okay.
And I think this can be broadened, but this is a specific question. How do you engage with a volunteer that is so perfectionistic that it is harmful for other volunteers? And I think that could be broadened out to be, how do you engage with a volunteer that is, you know, exhibiting negative behavior that is negatively affecting either the program or other volunteers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one that maybe I should talk to one-on-one. I would say that kind of the stock answer is, I think it goes back to your recruitment screening process and trying to learn about those tendencies ahead of time. And then from a volunteer supervision standpoint, having a presence with volunteers where you're giving feedback on a regular basis on their behavior and how their behavior is impacting people around them and the organization's culture. And making sure you're evaluating volunteers and not afraid to reassign, refer, retire, fire, you know, that volunteer. It might come to that point. So I think you deal with a perfectionistic volunteer, you know, across the engagement process, from recruitment screening through supervision and feedback and into evaluation. You know, I think that's a comprehensive process that you got to do all those things well, so a situation doesn't get to that point. And I would be chew on that, whoever asked that, chewing that a little bit. And if you want me to stay on a bit at the end, I'll be glad to talk some more scheduled time. So I'm going to share some different colored slides. They're orange and red. They come from the JF Fixler group out of Colorado. They're certified by the Points of Light Foundation as independent consultants on the service enterprise model. And I think they just have really great slides that really explain the difference between volunteer management and engagement, and how you move from a culture of managing volunteers and not focusing on the relationship with volunteers to a culture of volunteer engagement that's highly focused on staff and volunteer relationships. And so, just, I'm not going to read all these to you, but that idea that management to engagement, placement to negotiation, supervision to support, recognition to acknowledgement, just fundamentally a different way of doing our jobs to manage volunteers focused on relationships and focused on the needs of our volunteers, not just the needs of our organization, is going to put you in the framework to start engaging volunteers and not just simply managing them for the work that has to be done, to recognize that it's a two-way relationship. Traditionally, volunteer managers recruited, recognized, and retained, and individuals that focus on volunteer staff and volunteer relationships and get good at engaging volunteers and see their role as a volunteer engager. Instead of being a recruiter and a recognizer, they're a talent scout, a convener, a partner, a coach, a negotiator, a facilitator. It's fundamentally changing how you interact in your day-to-day relationships, those behavioral norms that you'll use from a leadership impact, management impact on those volunteers. There's some real benefits, and I think these are some good examples. I'll let you read, poke through them a little bit, but more people are going to choose your organization as the place to volunteer, and you're going to have more capacity beyond what the staff can achieve alone when you create a constructive culture using principles of volunteer engagement. You know that you have a culture of volunteer engagement when volunteer opinions and ideas are encouraged, valued, and acted upon. when everyone in the organization is a volunteer talent scout, and when adequate financial and other resources are dedicated to supporting a volunteer engagement program. You also know that you've created a more constructive culture that has better staff and volunteer relationships when volunteers have multiple paths to clear leadership opportunities, when volunteers are donors and donors are volunteers. And the emphasis on volunteer engagement is on results, meaning the outcomes of the organization with the target population, not on outputs related to numbers of volunteer hours or years or number of volunteers retained. So many of you have probably heard of the Points of Light Foundation and their research on all things volunteerism. Their virtual summit's coming up next month. Hope that you'll consider being a part of that. But their service enterprise model is, in short, really a model that changes the culture of how you manage volunteers to engage volunteers in a way that creates abundance. And what their research has found is when you create a culture, a constructive, healthy culture of volunteer engagement versus a defensive culture of volunteer management, you can essentially accomplish twice as much on half the median budget. And so there's a lot of research that supports that volunteer engagement helps you get to the outputs and outcomes, mission and vision better by better building relationships with volunteers to do the work of the organization with the people that you choose to serve. So volunteer engagement is high on relationships, and it builds organizational capacity using meaningful volunteer opportunities that increase impact, outcomes, and influence. Volunteer engagement, you know, what it does is it helps build capacity, and really capacity is about abundance, to have more resources to reach more people through more programs and services. And it's recognizing that volunteer engagement is focused on matching the needs of the organization with the skills and talents that volunteers want to share. Not recognizing not every CPA wants to do your audit or wants to be your treasurer. They might want to pass out food, right? So not recognizing that everybody that has a professional skill wants to share that to find a role for them. So really the process that we use to work with these clients, Newfields, Ronald McDonald House, Tippecanoe County CASA, and Special Olympics Indiana, is we used Susan Ellis's volunteer management audit. This book is getting a little old, but it's still a great book, good process. And in the Susan J. Ellis Foundation, this book is now free, as well as many of her other books. So if you haven't Googled Susan J. Ellis Foundation, a lot of her work and archives are now available free there. But in her book, she divides, and the assessment audit process looks at what she called the 12 areas of volunteer management. And you can see that one area is volunteer employee relationships. And these are the questions that really are scored low by clients, that generates really interesting discussion about how to create a more constructive culture by improving volunteer employee relationships. So just an idea here, element 7, this is straight from the audit process. The climate or culture within the organization is conducive to productive volunteer involvement. If you jump down to 4, in addition to training employees, we also train in volunteers and how to work as a team with paid staff. Employees throughout the agency, regardless of their position or their needs, interact with volunteers, have been trained in the basics of working with volunteers, and accept responsibility for creating a receptive climate. So you can hear the culture piece laced in there. We consider the ability to work with volunteers to be an important element of successful employment within our organization. Notice number 4, in addition to employee job descriptions and training, we enforce our concern for effective volunteer employee teamwork by including this area in the annual performance. It amazes me how many organizations rely on volunteers, but they don't evaluate their staff or recruit their staff on their ability to successfully work with volunteers. An employee who works successfully with volunteers receives public attention at recognition events, together with internal recognition for their work with volunteers. And we'll skip along to the next one here. A second area is staffing in the audit process. And a third area that impacts volunteer employee relationships is planning and resources. Particularly this one, employees have been trained to work with volunteers and understand the needs and motivations of volunteers. And the highest score here is that in addition to providing training to staff and working with volunteers, we regularly evaluate employees on their ability to work productively with volunteers, and when necessary, provide additional training to improve performance. So it's interesting to start thinking about your organization, and outside of the volunteer management department, how many of your staff are being being provided feedback, professional development, and evaluation with repercussions or motivation to do well in maintaining healthy relationships with volunteers.
Nathan, just a heads up, we've got about 12 minutes left.
Yeah, I see that. No, we're getting behind here. So we'll probably not do our breakout rooms, but we'll get through some of the tips here. So the bottom line is the 4 clients I'm going to share self-rated themselves really low on this area of their audit, volunteer employee relationships. And I just want to ensure that I've got permission from all 4 of these organizations. And I thank you to those that are on the call, particularly Mary and Chris, for letting me share some of the stuff that ended up in your volunteer action plan. So first of all, with Special Olympics, we had a couple issues here with Special Olympics Indiana. What we found through the audit process that they had minimal coordinated communication, really fragmented communication among staff regarding the volunteer program, its role, and how the volunteer services staff should or does interact with other departments. So they have the volunteer coordinators, but they also have regional managers, development, communications and marketing, and sports and competition, all using volunteers, but not necessarily good communication between the two. And then we also had volunteer retention issues because of some culture stuff. It was clear there that everybody at Special Olympics was 110% committed to athletes. However, it was real apparent there was a relational disconnect between the staff at the state office in Indy and then area and county volunteers around the state. But there really seemed to be a culture issue where I had recommended they do the culture audit with human synergistics before I had my training with them. These numbers aren't in order because I pulled it straight from their plans here. Other things that came up as kind of to-dos on their volunteer management action plan was to develop and implement a recognition program for those staff that effectively establish and maintain positive relationships with volunteers, and to engage volunteers in staff meetings when appropriate on a monthly basis. These are some other things that we encourage them to do to improve staff and volunteer relationships. Is that we wanted Special Olympics to assess and update their current job descriptions, their job announcements, the interview question guides that they use to interview staff, and the evaluation rubric to evaluate staff at the 6 month, the 1 year, the 3 year, where we want to ensure that the evaluation criteria includes building and maintaining and improving relationships with volunteers for all staff and volunteer positions that work with and or supervise volunteers, beginning with their regional managers. Special Olympics is a group where we have volunteers managing other volunteers, and many of you have that in your organizations. And think about how little training we provide between volunteer relationships. One of the things that we really needed to do with Special Olympics was to codify the role of regional managers as regional volunteer managers with a central role of supporting and building capacity in area and county volunteers who have volunteer management responsibilities. The regional managers, their primary job is to manage volunteers, but they didn't see themselves as volunteer managers because that was the volunteer coordinator's job. So very fragmented communication, and recognizing most of their staff really were volunteer managers. They just had different titles and didn't think of themselves as that, nor were volunteer management and volunteer engagement competencies in their job descriptions for any positions really, except the volunteer coordinators and the manager of volunteer services. The other thing that we wanted to share here is that objective 2 was to plan and implement a training strategy for all staff and volunteer positions that supervise volunteers. And jump into Special Olympics a little bit deeper here. We wanted to improve communication to all staff regarding the vision, logistics, and robustness of the volunteer program. It was really interesting how few staff really knew what happened over at the volunteer services cubicle, and really making sure that staff are onboarded to understand how important volunteerism is to the mission and how the volunteer program works, so that all staff were trained at some level, appropriate level, for understanding the volunteer program. This was another one we wanted, with volunteer input and in partnership with the manager of volunteer services, evaluate each staff member with volunteer engagement responsibilities per their new job description, and offer opportunities for professional development to improve the skills of the staff in their ability to have volunteer engagement skills. And you can see there, we even recognize that they might go on to get their CVA, or at least to start participating in CAVA. I want to jump into Ronald McDonald House. I know we're just down to about 8 minutes here, so I'm not sure we'll have a ton of time for discussion, Mary, but some things that came up on their audit was that they, one of their objectives was to articulate the organizational culture for staff and volunteers, ensure the current culture is aligned with the mission, and then include the culture statement in their volunteer and staff recruitment materials and volunteer and staff handbooks and volunteer and staff orientations. And then again, engaging volunteers more intentionally in staff meetings when appropriate. With Ronald McDonald House Charities of Central Indiana, we wanted to monitor all organizational decisions that impact the volunteer program on a monthly basis to determine their impact related to all things diversity. That was an area that they wanted to improve on. And with volunteer input, plan and implement and evaluate strategies for staff supervisors related to frequent and immediate feedback to direct report staff members. So really putting an emphasis on giving feedback to staff on how to improve their relationships, interaction to interaction with volunteers. We wanted to systematically identify in-service staff training needs related to volunteer engagement and execute reasonable solutions using a transfer partnership related to transfer of training and getting staff to apply training in their work with volunteers. New fields, we want to jump to new fields here. One of the key things we did with new fields is we really found, Chris, I think you guys rated that as number 12 out of 12, right? Your volunteer employee relationships. And what we found is one of the first things is we wanted to develop a tiered training where we would develop 3 tiers of training. Tier 1 was for all staff in their onboarding. Their volunteer services falls under human resources. And so there was a natural connection for the volunteer services staff to help with the HR onboarding so that all staff had an understanding of the volunteer program and its role and the opportunities and the mission. We created a tier 2 training for intermediate training for staff who work alongside of volunteers. And then we created a tier 3 training and advanced training for staff who actually supervise and utilize volunteers on a daily basis. And so we were able to develop that training over time and develop actually the learning outcomes for all 3 of those so that they're stepwise, so that tier 1, if you're going to do tier 2, you had to do tier 1. And if you did tier 3, you had to do tier 1 and tier 2 first. But we really came up with a plan that would help all the staff across the entire organization recognize the importance of volunteerism and getting to the mission, and coming up with a really creative tiered staff training to improve volunteer employee relationships. And then the last piece here, since we're just down to about 5 minutes, is we didn't do an audit process with Tippecanoe County CASA, but Tippecanoe County CASA had the goal, they hired me with the goal of making recommendations on how they could better retain CASA volunteers for 3.5 years on average. And that's a pretty tall order. If you don't know a lot about CASA, those individuals work as a sworn officer of the court in a fairly trauma-filled environment that can have secondary trauma on volunteers as they learn about a child's situation and make recommendations to a judge whether that child should be placed or stay back in their home or be placed in foster care. And as you really get into this process, what they asked me to do was to assess their organizational climate and then make recommendations on how their culture and climate is impacting their volunteer recruitment and retention. And so we did a qualitative process. We didn't do the human synergistics process, but I created essentially an interview guide to do a sniff test, to figure out if we had defensive or toxic issues going on, kind of hotspots, and really made recommendations based on that qualitative data, those one-on-one interviews with stakeholders across the organization on how to better improve volunteer recruitment and retention. And I came to the conclusions, I think these ones are worth sharing in the last 4 minutes, is that I think we know in the fundraising world, if you've done any fundraising is about relationships, right? And I think there's a lot we can learn as volunteer administration professionals from the fundraising world. you know, everything's about relationships and fundraising, and everything should be about relationships and volunteer engagement. And that idea that volunteer engagement is about relationships. It's just that for 1 year, for 1 year at CASA, we're asking a volunteer to give 195 hours of time in 1 year at CASA. 195 hours on a minimum at $24.85 on the value of a current volunteer hour comes up to just south of $5,000 in time and talent. And so when you think about that in the fundraising department, if your development director, for most of you, gets a $5,000 check for a donor, their name's going in a shout out on Facebook. It's going in the annual report. We're giving them a plaque. We're clapping for them at the banquet. Like $5,000 gift for most organizations, a major gift. But we don't treat our volunteers like major gift donors when they're giving us that kind of time and talent over that amount of time. And so I came to the conclusion on how to improve recruitment and retention. Hank Rosso said fundraising is the gentle art of teaching the joy of giving. And Dr. Robert Payton said philanthropy is any voluntary action for the public good, which includes volunteerism, just not donating money. And what I've really done is combined them to say, you know, major gift, and this kind of a term I've coined, major gift volunteer engagement is the gentle art of teaching the joy of voluntarily giving significant time and talent to a public or nonprofit organization, its mission, staff, and target population. And it's that idea that we have to start thinking about how do we track relationships to get a volunteer ready to make a major gift, just like a development director would get a donor or potential donor to the point in the relationship where they're willing to make a major gift for volunteer engagement. And so this idea that major gift volunteer engagement, it's relationship cultivation over time and a solicitation process for engaging volunteers. I've twice been asked to be basically board president for the Boy Scouts in our 6-county area. We call it district chair. But, you know, they called me like on Thanksgiving and they're like, your term would start January 1st. And it's like, come on, man, I need 2 years to responsibly disengage from all the other things I'm doing before I could take that on and get prepared to plan out what that year as board president would look like. I just didn't have the bandwidth to do what they were asking me to do, to really think about how we track volunteers, to put them in a position to be successful by asking them to do things for our organization on a time that they can do it. And so I'll leave you with this idea that major gift volunteer engagement is really the cultivation and appropriate solicitation of prospective volunteers over time using principles of volunteer engagement together with principles of major gift fundraising that take into account the needs of the prospective volunteer, their motivations, their bandwidth, their emotional quotient, those sorts of things. I think it's important to remember when we get into volunteer and staff relationships, if you're a fundraiser, you know, text to give is not the same. You're not going to text to give a $10,000 gift. Annual fundraising strategies are not the same as major gift fundraising. And volunteer recruitment and retention to park cars at a 5K for 2 hours is not the same as a major gift volunteer engagement and retention process to be a CASA volunteer for a year at 195 hours. And we really have to think about our strategies, and I think take into account what we can learn from the fundraising and development world on how to build relationships to get more out of our volunteers as we engage them. So I'm going to leave you with that since we're about out of time for the day. Obviously, we're running out, and I got a lot to say on these issues, but I think we end with this idea that we always have to come back to the CCVA ethics, professional ethics and volunteer management, and really self-reflect and think about how the concepts of citizenship, respect, accountability, fairness, and trust bleed into the volunteer employee relationships that we help build, and recognize as you move your organization from managing volunteers to engaging volunteers, you'll be doing your part to create a more constructive and healthy culture for volunteer engagement. And really recognizing and reflect on the fact that it really all starts with you and your organization if you're going to help create this culture of volunteer engagement and high volunteer employee relationships. So that's what I have for you today. I know some of you got to go, but I can stay on if there's any discussion or questions today. I'd be really glad to talk through some of the concepts, and appreciate the time to chat with you a little bit today about volunteer and employee relationships. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chris. Did Chris have to go?
Thank you, Nathan. That was very, very helpful.
I hope it helps. Like I said, I know some of you have to step off. You have 10:30 or 11 o'clock appointments, but if you have questions, I'm glad to stay on. I have plenty of time to answer questions or help brainstorm or whatever anybody might need today.
There was a
Nathan?
question. There was a question in the chat about a link for the crucial conversations.
Oh, sure. I can text that through. Let me stop share and let me get to a web browser and I can find that link for you.
Nathan, this is Meg Booth. I was curious. We have a lot of Girl Scout volunteer managers from throughout our whole council on today.
Okay.
And some are brand new and some have been managing volunteers for as long as you and I and some others on. What would you say to a new volunteer manager on engaging them and engaging volunteers, and what suggestions might you give?
I think the very first thing is just recognize it's not about you or your organization and what you and your organization need done. It's what do they want out of the experience. I think if you just start there, I think that's the very simplest starting point, is always put the emphasis on what the volunteer wants out of the experience so that you can create an experience that they're going to enjoy, and recognize that volunteer programs are a program area. And you know, the world, especially in scouting, you know, you go to excuse me a second. You go to STEM, you go to dining hall, you go to shooting sports, you go to campcraft, you go to aquatics, you go to boating. Volunteerism is a program area, and it requires us to think about why people do what they do for fun in their free time, and recognize that a lot of volunteer management, you need to take in concepts of being a leisure professional or a recreation manager, and think about how do you make this an experience where people feel and are safe and comfortable, but where they're also having a good time and getting out of the experience what they want. And so I think especially for Girl Scout professionals, if you think of it as a program area where your volunteers are coming to be a program participant in volunteerism, to have a fun leisure experience, I think you're going to put more emphasis on what they want out of the experience, which will create a better culture, and it will keep bringing them back as repeat program participants in your volunteer program. I don't know if that's too simplistic, but I think it's a great start if you're just getting into this business of being a volunteer coordinator.
That makes a lot of sense. Coming from the training department and the volunteer experience, a lot of our outdoor trainings, we have a strong passion. People sign up for those more than the required safety. I don't know, the new leader training. I mean, once we have them hooked, they love the experiential trainings. So that made sense to me.
Yeah, like quite frankly, and I think even in my own personal life, I've gotten more from the Boy Scouts as an adult leader than I did as I've developed more to the Scout Oath and Law as an adult than I did as a child, you know. And so, you know, I see volunteerism as another opportunity to keep promoting the mission, vision, and values of the organization to people who aren't technically program participants. They're there to be volunteers to help kids, but they're often becoming better scouts as adult volunteers than when they were program participants. And I see it as an opportunity to move additional people to your mission.
Thank you.
So I see Wendy chatted in. Wendy, do you want to share that point?
Sure. I've been doing a lot of research, attending a lot of webinars this last year has really given me that silver lining to attend and really expand who I listen to, what I take in, and how I can really look at my volunteers in a way that is not a program. A program, especially in the library structure, is summer reading, or it's bringing in silly safari, so we have animals, or concerts. And they are viewed as a beginning and an end program. And volunteerism within the library structure is not a beginning and an end. It is an unpaid workforce that is strategic to the success of all things within our library structure, just as strategic as our personnel, much like your Elmer's glue picture. They are all part of making us move forward toward the mission of our organization. And I cannot subscribe any longer. And it's been a year to take me to get to this point. I can't subscribe to saying that volunteer activities within my organization are a program. It is a strategic engagement that's mission driven, but program isn't a word that I'm using anymore.
Okay. No, I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's both. I think the way you described it is what it really is. But as volunteer managers, if we're going to build strong relationships, we have to think that people are coming for a satisfying program experience. I think we're on the same page. I think we're calling it a tomato and a tomato. I don't disagree with anything that you said. And if I was a volunteer manager speaking at an ED conference, I would describe volunteer engagement as exactly what you just described as. So.
Right. The other part of it too is I'm beginning to think of my word volunteer manager differently as well. I am really deciding that volunteer manager, my word manager, needs to be tossed out and it needs to be turned into leader. I'm providing leadership to not only my staff, but also to my volunteers, as opposed to, I'm leading the way, as opposed to management from above. So I've really looked a lot at how management is perceived versus how leadership is perceived. So I'm shifting over to leadership as well.
Yeah, I agree. Management needs to be, I think, thrown out. A leader is better. I'm not sure it fully explains what we do, but it's certainly better than manager. A volunteer engager just doesn't sound good on a business card or an email signature, right? But
not at all.
Right. I'd like, if there was a better word than engager, I think that's what I would look for. But I think it's one as a group we need to think about. Sure. And I think maybe some of that's coming from CCVA. I think administrator sounds a little too monolithic, at least to me. But I'm just, I think leader's probably the best one for now. But I think it's important as how the strategies we use, how they change. I think we have to change that job title too, if possible. No, you bring up a lot of great points, though. Any other questions? I know there are a lot of folks on still. Like I said, I've got time to have conversation and that sort of thing, but I don't want to keep people on longer than you wanted to be on today. So.
Can you talk some to mini cultures? Because we serve 45 counties, we have a lot of, I would say, kind of mini cultures. One area here reacts and volunteers in a different way than, Metro Indianapolis does.
Yeah, sure. I think I've seen those more with our more confederated nonprofits. So Special Olympics Indiana's tie with Special Olympics International. They have this cascaded international Indiana affiliate, and then they have areas and counties and local, it's a very cascaded, program, just like Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, those kinds of organizations. And I've seen subcultures, and actually the work that Human Synergistics does is they can tease out basically the stuff that's colored in on the current culture on that circumplex, they can actually organize their data where they can give you subculture circumplexes. Does that make sense? So that you can see if it's by geography or type of volunteer, they can produce subculture circumplex in however you would want to do that. And I would say I've not done enough with human synergistics in their research to espouse that I have a lot to say about subcultures, but I know, I've experienced them as you have, and very, very different attitudes and behaviors, with different groups of people and organizations like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and Special Olympics. So I agree they exist. I know they can be helpful or a problem. I'm not sure I have a silver bullet answer on how to get all the subcultures in one constructive direction. It seems like, there's a lot of trauma in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts when it comes to volunteerism with place attachment. Camps are being sold, councils are merging, patches on our shoulders are changing, where people go to camp. There's so much place attachment and heart with those organizations with their volunteers. Where my attitude, as long as the kids are getting good program, and we're reinforcing the values and mission, then I'm good with it as a Boy Scout volunteer. But not every Boy Scout or Girl Scout volunteer is that open. They're still cut up to how we've always done it, or there's at least in the Boy Scouts and a lot of counselors, a very anti-professional scouter, volunteers. It's just like a sport to rip on and degrade the professional staff in the Boy Scouts, and that's an unfortunate consequence. But every geographic area I've lived in, there seems to be a core group of volunteers that like to criticize the professional scouters for only worrying about numbers, membership, fundraising, those sorts of things. And there's, those volunteers treat the new volunteers or train the new volunteers to behave that way too. It's interesting. I've been a scouting volunteer now for 25 years. And I can bump into somebody at Camp Ree that's maybe been involved a year or two, and they're saying things that I've heard from somebody that's been doing it 50 years, the way they're criticizing a professional staffer. So that idea that culture is learned and taught is certainly true, and that culture can be constructive or toxic. And I agree, there are a lot of subcultures. I'm not sure I have the best answer on how to fix them yet. I think that's something that maybe the work that you and I do with Indiana State, maybe we should kick that around some more. I have a volunteer management course in the spring. Maybe we can do now it's volunteer engagement course. Maybe that's something we can look at in that course, maybe through some service learning, and explore that some more. Might be a fun project to do if that's something you'd want to work on.
Awesome.
I'd be interested.
Yeah, I don't have the answer. I think we could dig in and figure it out some more together.
Well, and I think it's, in our case too, where we have a lot of new staff going into new areas where they have to get to know the volunteers before they can effectively engage them, because they don't know them yet. And those volunteers are so strong in the area, like Pam was talking about. You might have a volunteer who is running that space because she's been there so long, and the staff person comes in and out. So that's something you have to just sit back and listen and learn, and really before you can affect change.
Yeah, I agree. That's a tough problem in those bigger organizations.
Well, and also with the indirect management, indirect relationship with volunteers, in the sense that they're not in our office doing work. We're not at all of their troop meetings. So we may be like going off down one of my rabbit holes that I love, that other organizations don't experience as much. But how do you avoid the parking lot conversation and leave things positively and yet not micromanage it, because that doesn't work. So it's a different type of and that's why I like the word engagement rather than managing, because we're not at the troop meeting saying, no, you should do this. I mean, we give them the tools, and then they get to make it their experience.
Yeah. So you guys have that problem too, the meeting after the meeting in the parking lot? Yeah, I can't think of one time where that's been a positive conversation that I've been a part of. Like, wow, we really love our professional staff and things are great and, you know, humanistic and encouraging and blue on the circumflex, right? It's usually a red or green conversation happening in general. I'm painting with some broad strokes, but yeah, those are issues. And I think if we've had that all figured out, you know, we would have better answers for that. But I think we have to think about, you know, we don't, in a lot of organizations, we don't articulate what our culture is. We don't talk about what culture we're moving towards. We don't talk about how our individual behaviors contribute to that culture. You know, so many organizations, at the very least, just with the Boy Scouts, you register as an adult leader. They do the background check. You do your youth protection training and you do your hazardous weather, and all of a sudden you're a volunteer at the troop level, right? You know, and then all the culture stuff just happens to you. I don't think we know. So many organizations really don't even know what their culture is or have articulated, and they don't have a goal for how to improve it. And they're not talking about culture as a strategic initiative area that they want to work on. And I think if we start doing that more from the board level and in our strategic plans and really make culture something that we talk about and something that we strive to improve, I think you're going to find more of that stuff's going to make it into volunteer onboarding and volunteer recruitment, volunteer motivation, some of those things. I think we've all seen volunteers that are just motivated for the wrong reasons. It might be the recognition, not for the girls, right? You know, and I don't know if you have as many problems with that in the Girl Scouts as I see we do with some volunteers in the Boy Scouts, but you know, I think part of it's, you know, feedback, and also part of it's volunteer evaluation, right? And it's moving people along if there's somebody that's really causing a subculture or, you know, that toxic volunteer. I think there's that point where you got to move some of those people along. There's a really great consultant she's out of California. Her consulting firm's called Volunteer Relations, and she's got a really interesting process. But basically, her whole consulting firm is just based on dealing with toxic volunteers. Not nonprofit management in general, or specifically volunteer engagement or audits, but specifically dealing with volunteer conflict management. And I'm going to post her. She's got some really good stuff online now too. I actually use it in my classes at Indiana State in the area of volunteer employee relationships. It's the Volunteer Relations Consulting Group out of, I think she's down around LA. But she's got some tremendous stuff on volunteer conflict, and she's actually a former Girl Scout professional. And a lot of the work that she did is based on her experiences as a volunteer and as a professional in Girl Scouting. And I think if you give her a call and just say, hey, Nathan from Indiana sent you her way.
Talked to her.
Have you?
Yeah.
Yeah, her work has actually ended up in the the new draft, the new version of the new CCVA study guide book. Her stuff on volunteer conflict management. She's got some really, she's just an expert in it. I've learned from her. I mean, I'll call her and ask her how to deal with something, because, you know, what she does in her sleep or has forgotten, I'm still trying to learn. She's really great. And she works with Girl Scout councils all over the country. So I hope that helps. She's a great resource though. So, well, I hope this has been helpful. I know some of you are still on. I'm glad to continue to take some questions. I don't think I have anything till 11:30, so I'm glad to continue to spitball and kick around some of these ideas related to culture and volunteer employee relationships.
Dr. Nathan, there was a question in the chat box that was asking, what is a good way to engage volunteers as a new person coming to them?
I think the easiest thing is ask open-ended questions and listen. I really think taking time and slowing down and looking at your workload. If you're a volunteer manager, creating time and space just to spend time with volunteers and ask a question and let them talk, and really genuinely and authentically want to get to know them. A lot of us just don't have the time and space in our to-do list to do that. It's trying to figure out what you can say no to or what you can delegate to create more time for relationship building on your to-do list. If you could block out time for relationship building on your to-do list, like this appointment for the last 2 hours, I mean, I think a lot of us would be doing a better job, right? If we could just make time for the people that are volunteering for us.
It's all about the relationships.
Yeah, and that just takes time. You know, that's coffee at Starbucks. It's a walk at a park near a volunteer's house. You know, I mean, it's just the easy. It's like the parents that got to fly their kid to Disney World 4 times a year, as opposed to let them play with a cardboard box in the backyard while you build a fort out of it, right? It's the Christmas gifts that are the cheapest. It's the box, not the toy that's in it. I think it's the same thing with relationship building. It's just being present. Turn your phone off and take a walk and make sure you make it about them and what they want out of the experience.
Instead of what do I need you to do to help me meet my numbers?
Yeah, I'm stressed out and I got 50 million things and I don't have time to take your call and I don't care what you want, but I need you to do X, Y, and Z by yesterday, right?
Yeah. Somebody else asked, how can we engage college students for fun and leisure activities when we really need them to attend and help at troop meetings?
Ask that again. I heard college students. It cut out there for a second.
How can we engage college students for fun and leisure activities when we really need them to attend and help at troop meetings?
Right. So I think the first thing is find a pocket of college students who find Girl Scout meetings fun. Right. So
Okay.
that could be, for example, Kate just left her desk there. Kate and I work together through Indiana State. We have an Alpha Phi Omega chapter at Indiana State. And I think many of you know APO is the largest fraternity. It's a co-ed service fraternity based on Girl Scout and Boy Scout principles. It was originally founded as an all Eagle Scout fraternity almost 100 years ago, and it's evolved over the years to be co-ed. It's learning leadership through service, and it's based on Girl Scout and Boy Scout principles. And I'm a faculty advisor, and then we have a staffer at the Center for Community Engagement that's the staff advisor, and then Kate is our Girl Scout advisor, and then we also have our local district executive for the Boy Scouts as our Boy Scout advisor. And so we're an advisement team. Kate and I work together on that. And the first thing I would say is, if Girl Scouts, need help in, the Terre Haute area, not far from ISU, it would be Kate and I targeting those APO members that could go out and consistently work with units that, or maybe walking or biking distance from campus, right? I think that's that strategy. And there are a lot of groups on campuses that could help with that. I don't think you want to just get the students that need, that are in Chem 101, but their professor says you have to do 20 volunteer hours, at the youth center. Now, first of all, what's 20 hours at the youth center have to do with chemistry 101? And, if they're getting voluntold, they're probably not going to be worth the time that you're going to spend, and they're probably not going to be all that beneficial to the kids.
And Stacy serves and works with the local Terre Haute area, so she'd be great to come in and speak to an APO meeting and let them know what she needs.
Yeah, and Stacy, are you based out of the Terre Haute office?
Yes, I am, and
Okay.
I'll put my contact information in the chat for you.
Yeah, I
so
know
we
where you
can
work.
connect.
I'm really good at walking on that path along the river by your office. So
Yes.
anytime you want to put your head together with mine, we used to work with that office a lot, but I went on sabbatical and then got busy with redoing a curriculum, and then staff turned over, and then you know
Hook
how it
back up with
goes,
Stacy.
right? So we need to get back together. You guys were on my list this fall to revisit with anyways. I was going to actually ask Kate, who was over there, that I should contact. Yeah, but we could definitely do that.
We would love to do that. That would be great.
So good. Well, I
Those
hope
are relationships that we probably all need to look at. I'm from Bloomington, right down here with IU. We've got Girl Scouts over by Ball State. There's colleges all around in this central Indiana area that could really build some great partnerships with.
Yeah, and I will. Let me just share my screen one more time before. Is everybody left? Pretty much the Girl Scout crowd?
No, there's a few other people.
A few others? Let's see. I don't think I'm sharing the page that I want to share here. So this is, are you seeing my website now, Kate?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is my website. And if you just scroll down, this Cooperate book is specifically a book I wrote on how to partner with colleges and universities to get free or reduced stuff. And so the whole book is about all the nuggets that you can uncover to get help with the things that you need to do your job and your strategic plan. Indiana Campus Compact owns the copyright. And so any money made from that book actually goes back to Indiana Campus Compact, specifically for the Faculty Fellows Fund. So anytime a professor at a university or college anywhere in Indiana works with Indiana Campus Compact to do a service learning project or to train faculty to work with folks, that book generates, and we still haven't made enough money for what we spent on it, but if it ever is revenue positive, it will help go back into the fund for service learning projects. So I don't make anything on it, but myself and a group of 6 or 7 of us wrote that, and it's basically written like a blog. It's not researchy, and it's all of the ways that you can uncover things at local colleges and universities, e-volunteerism, working with fraternity and sorority life. How do you get approved as a federal work study site? So I know most of you know universities take federal work study money from the government, from the US government. The way that law is written is they have to spend at least 7% of that on student employment positions to serve nonprofits. And so we have contracts with like 30 nonprofits in Terre Haute, in the Terre Haute area at Indiana State, where our students are ISU student employees. They get paid by ISU, but they work at nonprofits like the Candles Holocaust Museum. They're Scout Reach program aides for the Boy Scouts. I think the Girl Scouts were set up on that for some time and maybe still are. 14th and Chestnut Community Center, Catholic Charities. And if there's a literacy component in the work that you're doing, you get those staff for free, and the staff get paid like $10 an hour. If there's not a literacy component, you pay 25 cents on the dollar. So, you know, you're quadrupling your part-time staff budget, you know, to partner not just with Indiana State, but any university that's, you know, has that funding source, you can get benefit. So this book, this is kind of like the secret to getting stuff. You know, I know a lot of you don't have grant databases and can't afford them or get access to them. You know, we have all of the grant databases that our university uses. I have an intern working with Children's Relief International right now and going to Africa. One of her internship goals is to write a grant proposal to fund some of their nutrition and dietetics programs. So I connected her supervisor and her with our grant office and got them accounts set up and got them free training on how to use these really expensive databases for free. You know, and that was just a benefit that they hosted an intern. So I was able to get them access through that office. And that's what this book does. Like it's not just volunteer hours. It's all the little ways you can get help with stuff you need help with from a university or college. So hope maybe that helps especially for our Girl Scout recruiters that are looking for college students.
I think Meg has a copy of that too in her office.
Oh, does she? Okay, good. Yeah, I hope.
So.
Yeah, it wasn't written to make money. It was just written to help folks like you that can help us. You know, it's a win-win for us. You know, we get opportunities to do community engagement and service learning, and we get opportunities to have better, you know, better instruction. And we get lots of colleagues that can be internship supervisors. And so many of the things you all do developmentally with our students are things we can't do in the classroom. I mean, it's really a win-win for both of us. So hope that helps.
Yeah.
So. Good. Well, I appreciate everybody's time today. Are there any final questions or concerns?
Thanks for all your time.
Glad to. Thanks for having me.
You
well, you all have a wonderful day. I'm not too hard to find. If you just Google me, you'll find my website, or you'll find me at Indiana State. And if I can help you through my role at Indiana State with my students, I will. And, you know, that's always a good first place to start. Like with Girl Scouts here in Terre Haute, you know, anything we do, let's put on my ISU hat and see what we can do for free, right? And engage students. And then if you have something that I really can't make a part of my job with my students, then we, you know, talk about doing it through the consulting side, you know, through the other hat. But anytime I can, anytime I can make it a part of my role at Indiana State and help my students learn and help you out at the same time for free, that's what we try to do first. The other tip I'll give you, if you're looking for the community engagement, nonprofit volunteer type professors at campuses near you, so if you're not in Terre Haute, go to Google Indiana Campus Compact and contact their staff and say, I'm a Girl Scout volunteer manager in Muncie. Who are the best professors for me to work with? And they'll tell you. If you're up in, you know, Lafayette, who's going to open their door and do free stuff for me and help their students out of Purdue? They know all the go-to movers and shakers that like to do this community engagement stuff from a university standpoint, and they would really help you. And if you can't find them, just email me. And if I know somebody at that campus, I'll email you or I'll forward it to Indiana Campus Compact for you to help make a connection at a campus that's closer to your volunteer locations and offices.
Okay.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. I hope that helps. Kate, I hope to see you soon. Stacy, I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, we'll talk to you later. I'm gonna leave now. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.